Hi there, everyone. Normally, Professor Henson and I will be unpacking the news together, but today I'll be on my own as Professor Henson is off fighting an illness this week, so we hope he'll be better soon, and next time he'll be back and we'll do this together. But for today, you're stuck with me. Now, last time we talked about Texas's mid-decade congressional redistricting efforts, which did ultimately end up passing, as we suggested they would, with the new maps being signed into law by Governor Abbott on August 29th. While the redistricting effort generated the most national attention and coverage, that effort also took place during the second of two special sessions in the Texas Legislature during which they addressed or didn't address a really wide range of issues. So what I'd like to do today is unpack the output of the special session a little bit more. And in particular, I want to look at a few different issues that suffered different fates and discuss what we can learn by looking at these issues in the context of some public opinion data that Dr. Henson and I just collected in our roles at the Texas Politics Project. You're about to learn a lot more about the legislature and its powers, and the powers of the governor vis-a-vis the legislature in the segments that are coming up in the next few modules. So this is something of a preview of what's to come. So again, you're going to get a lot more information on this. Let's begin with a quick recap of the session from our friends over at KVUE.
Governor Greg Abbott signed Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 1 into law. The bills aim to make Texas youth camps safer after the deadly flooding on July 4th killed 25 campers and 2 counselors at Camp Mystic in Kerr County.
Now, while lawmakers approved the new camp safety measures during the special session, other priorities didn't make it across the finish line. And as KVUE's Daniel Perot reports, Governor Abbott says he may call lawmakers back to the Capitol for another round.
The House stands adjourned, sine die.
Days after state lawmakers gavelled out the second special session,
we're going to see a lot of you back again. I hope not until January 27.
Governor Greg Abbott hinting at calling a third special session focused on issues that fell short this summer.
I would say stay tuned on that. Something may be happening soon.
Chief among them, state lawmakers were not able to come to an agreement on the issue that led to a special session in the first place: hemp products containing THC. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has pushed for a ban, while the governor has pushed for strict regulation of the industry.
We want to make sure those that choose to use the product can do so safely and reliably know what's in that product.
In an interview with KVUE Thursday, Plano Republican State Representative Matt Shaheen said he's hopeful the governor is done calling special sessions.
Ultimately, he has that power, but I think it's time to move on and let us live our lives, and it'll be campaign season before you know it.
In a social media post in response to the governor's comments, Austin Democrat State Senator Sarah Eckhart said, calling another session would admit the governor wasted our time on redistricting and other distractions from real business. Among the other items that fell short, an omnibus flood bill, communication interoperability, banning taxpayer-funded lobbying, and capping increases on local property taxes.
We will evaluate those options later.
Governor Abbott weighing whether to wait until the next regular session in 2027 or call lawmakers back to Austin sooner to address unfinished priorities.
And that was Daniel Perot reporting. Now, there's no limit to the number of special sessions the governor can call, and he can call them at any time.
All right, let me provide you with a little bit more context here. First, the governor of Texas has the sole authority to call the legislature into session outside of their normally scheduled legislative sessions. Now, if you don't already know this, you'll soon learn that the Texas legislature only meets for 140 days every 2 years, during which time they're only constitutionally required to pass a budget. So outside of very unusual circumstances, they only meet outside of this 140-day window if the governor calls the legislature in for what is known as a special session, which lasts for no more than 30 days. In addition to being able to call the special session and to call as many special sessions as he wants, as the reporter made clear, the governor also gets to set the agenda for that special session. In other words, the governor alone gets to determine what topics can be considered by the legislature. Now, while the governor can't force the legislature to pass a particular bill, he can strongly dictate the type of legislation that they can consider based on the language that he uses to call them into the special session. This is known as the special session call. Though it still remains up to the legislature to pass a given bill or not. They are the lawmaking body after all. So what did the governor ask the legislature to consider during the special sessions? Well, actually, quite a lot, to be quite honest. Now, I'm not going to go over all of these. because it really is just a ton of items, right? And even in the second special session, which he makes a new call for, the governor still asks them to respond to a lot of different items. Now, the issues that really ended up earning the most attention included redistricting, as we already discussed, responding to the flooding in Central Texas over the July 4th weekend, the failure to create further property tax reductions, which is potentially a story for another day, but it's a very complicated one, and some conservative legislation relating to bathroom access and abortion pills. But if this list of issues overall seems kind of, I don't know, maybe even random to you, that's okay, because to some extent it is. The priorities identified by the governor reflect a lot of different priorities in politics that may be more or less apparent, and even to the people who pay very close attention to state politics. By its very nature, the special session call is a political act. This list of issues is based on serious consideration of different groups whose support the governor cares about in the upcoming elections, plural. First, the primary elections, where partisans choose which candidates are going to run under the party name, and then in the general election, when the two parties run against each other. And while the governor shares a party with the majority in both chambers of the legislature, it was never guaranteed, and in fact, pretty unlikely that all of these agenda items were going to produce legislation that the governor could or would eventually sign. 30 days is not a very long time for complex legislation, and even 60 days, with Democrats largely absent during the first half, isn't very long either. So it was never very likely that the legislature was going to be able to pass all of this legislation in the 30-day special session, heck, even in two 30-day special sessions. On the one hand, the legislature was able to deliver on a lot of these items. We got new congressional maps, as we discussed. We saw some flood relief, though, as the video makes clear, they were unable to move the bill forward on some other key areas related to future responses. They were able to pass a bill prohibiting bathroom access in government buildings, which has been a long-term priority. New powers given to private citizens to sue abortion pill providers. An end to the STAR test, which I'm sure a lot of you took many times and have thoughts about. New punishments for quorum breakers, who we spoke about last week. In other words, those Democrats who left the state and slowed down the process, but ultimately didn't stop it. But there were also some notable misses during the special sessions, including some important aspects of the flood response, a further reduction in property taxes, and a ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying, as it's called. Now, I don't think anyone here would have the patience to go through all of these issues and agenda items. So I thought we could look at three issues in the context of public opinion to give some explanations about where and how the legislature did and did not act and what we can learn from it. So in particular, we're going to look at some public perceptions can tell us about how the legislature responded to the flooding, strict regulations for bathroom usage in public buildings, which did pass, and hemp, marijuana, or THC regulation, whatever you want to call it, which failed to result in any legislation making its way to the governor. Now, as I already mentioned, Professor Henson and I just released our most recent University of Texas Politics Project poll of registered voters in Texas, which focused in no small part on the efforts of the legislature during the first two special sessions. The poll surveyed 1,200 registered voters in Texas between August 22nd and September 1st, 2025. Data was collected online by YouGov based on a questionnaire created by Professor Henson, myself, and Professor Darren Shaw of the UT Government Department. The survey has an overall margin of error of plus or minus 2.83 percentage points for the full sample. Now, this poll was the latest in a time series going back to 2008 with over 65, maybe even 70 surveys and counting at this point. These are used primarily throughout the web text, especially in the investigations, which you guys should have seen so far. This data resource allows us to both check in and see how voters are responding to contemporary political issues, but also to see how opinions are changing or remaining the same over time, both overall and among key groups in the electorate. All of this data is publicly available on the Texas Politics Project website if you want to check it out, if you're that kind of nerd, kind of like me, okay? All right, let's begin with a little bit of context before diving in. Now, it's very common for people to project their own views onto others, and this includes their level of attention and interest in any given subject. One thing that we like to do in our polling is to include a battery of questions aimed at assessing how much Texans have heard about different state and national political stories, so that we can know if a big political story is actually a big story, or just a big story among people who follow politics. Two different things. So let's start by looking at how much Texans have even heard about the special session. It's always useful to have some points of comparison when looking at numerical data. Otherwise, we're left with comparing the result to our own expectations, which may or may not be justifiable. So for example, if I told you that 47% of Texans said that they had heard a lot about the special session, would you say that's a lot, or would you say that's a little? Without more information, it totally depends on your own expectations. So let's look at some more information. Here, we have a table showing the share of Texas voters who said that they had heard a lot about each of these state and national political stories in the August poll. You might notice that the flooding in Central Texas is what Texans heard the most about from among these stories, with nearly 3 out of every 4 saying that they had heard a lot about it. A big story here in Texas, no doubt. At the bottom of the table, most Texans aren't hearing a lot about the U.S. Senate race next year, despite all the attention being paid to the race if you follow politics closely. And if you do follow politics closely, this result should provide you with a real gut check about an important political race that, nonetheless, is still over a year away. And as the data indicate, not front and center for most people, certainly not most voters. Now, the special session, you may notice, falls somewhere near the bottom of the middle of the stories tested. Now, as someone who studies public opinion, this isn't entirely surprising. People tend to hear a little more about national stories almost by definition. That's why they're national stories. And most people, as I'm sure you can all probably appreciate, don't have a ton of interest in or thoughts about the state legislature. And so they really don't seek out news about it, especially during the summer when they'd rather be doing, summery things, hanging out by the pool, whatever. At the same time, these results do actually indicate that almost half of all registered voters had been hearing a lot about the special session, which is actually kind of a lot for state government, even if significantly less than some of the other stories. Now, more specifically, if we ask people how much active attention they're paying to the legislature as opposed to just hearing news about it, we see a much more conservative response. With only 15% saying that they're paying a lot of attention, which, though more than twice the share who said the same in our June polling, likely reflecting how active Texas politics has been during the summer month, is still pretty low overall. So, before going into any other results, I want to point out something important here. Just because something happens in politics, even something big, like mid-decade redistricting of congressional maps, new abortion restrictions, and a quote-unquote bathroom bill, it doesn't mean that people are paying attention or that these issues are going to matter in the context of elections over a year away. Not that they won't, it's just a long time from now. A lot is going to happen between now and the fall campaigns, and between then and when people actually vote. And in all honesty, we just don't know the impact of these issues yet. Now, just because people aren't paying a ton of active attention, it doesn't mean that they don't have views. They most certainly do. And so let's look at the public responses to 3 issues on the special session agenda, starting with responding to the floods. In order to assess Texans' response to the special session agenda, we asked our survey respondents how important it was for the legislature to address most of the issues on the call. Survey respondents were presented with the following question. As you may know, Governor Greg Abbott recently called a special session of the Texas Legislature to address the following items. Please tell us how important or unimportant you think it is for the legislature to address each of the following in a special session. We're going to start by looking at the share of Texans who said it was extremely important to address each issue. Now, this doesn't mean that the remainder thought the issue was unimportant, as respondents could have said an issue was very or somewhat important. But here we're focusing on intensity. At the top of the list is flood relief. Flood relief hung heavy over this special session for good reason. While redistricting was dominating coverage and attention of news, given its inherently and explicitly political reasoning, responding or not responding to the floods was used by both sides to shame the other. Democrats blamed Republicans for prioritizing redistricting and other hyper-partisan measures over flood relief. Republicans blamed Democrats for denying flood relief while out of state to delay the congressional maps. But ultimately, it was all but guaranteed that some kind of response to the flooding would pass. Why? Well, because everyone had heard a lot about it, and more importantly, everyone thought it was super important for the legislature to address it. So while the legislature acted, and there are definitely more politics under the surface here, the basic story is one of a clear signal from the electorate and a clear response from the legislature. Put more cynically, if you will, it would be a tougher environment for the incumbent party to run in the election next year had they not responded to the flooding. I guarantee there would have been advertisements about the lack of a response to the flooding by the legislature. And while I couch it as cynicism, it's also just as readily understood as responsiveness to a clear signal from the electorate. Okay. Another special session agenda item involved making it illegal to use a public restroom in a government building that doesn't match the sex one was assigned at birth, often kind of quickly referred to as a bathroom bill. The legislature was successful in passing legislation on this front, and as of the date of this recording, the governor hasn't signed the bill yet, but is expected to. So if we go back to that priority list for a second, we see that only 36% of Texans said that this was extremely important for the legislature to address. So why then did this pass while other issues higher up in importance fail? To explain that, it's important to let's introduce an important way of understanding how elections in Texas condition the legislative agenda and to some extent legislative output. We're going to talk more about this later in the course, I'm sure. But to put it briefly, no Democrat has won a statewide election in Texas in over 2 decades. Republicans hold majorities in both the Texas House and the Texas Senate, while members of both parties, more often than not, represent districts that are very unlikely to elect someone from the opposite party. This is part of the gerrymandering that we talked about last time on Unpacking the News. You may also recall from last time that part of the redistricting effort that created more Republican seats in Congress did so by making some Democratic-held seats even more Democratic, while creating seats Republicans should win. In other words, districts where we would expect significantly more Republican voters to turn out in a general election than Democratic voters. So the consequence of having sitting politicians draw their own districts, whether during the normal redistricting process or now during the recent mid-decade process, is that many general election contests are just not competitive, which means the only competitive race that many Texas politicians face is in their own primary elections, where they run against fellow party members for the right to run under the party's name in the general election. This electorate is made up entirely of partisans, and often partisans who are more ideologically extreme than the remaining partisans who don't participate, and certainly more extreme than the electorate as a whole. So let's look at those results a little bit more closely. What you'll notice is that while not a lot of voters overall think that regulating bathroom access is an important agenda item for the legislature to consider, nearly 2/3 of Republicans said it was extremely important, near the top of all the issues asked about among Republicans. And among the most conservative voters in the electorate, who tend to have a big influence in low turnout primary elections, especially Republican primaries, 3/4 said it was extremely important that the legislature address this issue. And if you combine that with those who said it was merely very important, we get to 90% of the most conservative voters. In short, this passed because it was important to the Republican electorate, and especially to potential Republican primary voters. By and large, the nature of support for this issue explains why the legislature was able to pass legislation here on what was, by comparison, not a very important issue to voters. Okay, let's finish up real quick on hemp, THC, or marijuana regulations, which did not pass. The story here is interesting in that the lieutenant governor tried to comprehensively ban all hemp-derived products during the regular session. The House unexpectedly agreed, and then the governor ended up vetoing that bill. This veto was, before the flooding and redistricting push, the big impetus for the special session. Ultimately, the governor asked the legislature to regulate these products, not ban them, and the Senate, led by the lieutenant governor, continued to push for a complete ban. The House, wisely, decided to just stay out of it this time, so nothing happened. How might public opinion inform this? Well, pretty directly, actually. First, this was not a priority for voters. Only 14% said it was extremely important to regulate hemp. Unlike with the bathroom bill, no one seemed to think this was very important either. Furthermore, when asked whether the state should make its marijuana laws more strict, less strict, or left alone in that very same survey, nearly half of Texas voters said they wanted these laws made less strict, the opposite of any legislation that would have been passed. And among Republicans, opinions are, at best, split, with equal shares wanting the laws made more or less strict. But taken together, the share of Republicans wanting the laws left alone or made less strict makes up a majority, 55%, which helps explain why the legislature wasn't able to settle on any legislation here. In short, if the majority party wanted to follow their voters on this issue, it's not clear where they would follow them. This lack of a clear signal led to different priorities and ultimately the failure to pass anything. Okay. I hope that by unpacking some of what the legislature accomplished and some of what it didn't in the context of public opinion, you've gained a better understanding of how voters, and different groups of voters really, can condition the actions of elected officials and of the legislature as a whole. Sometimes we have to look a little more closely to understand just how and when public opinion is and is not exerting its influence. But here we saw the legislature respond somewhat decisively when faced with a clear priority from all the voters. Maybe even more decisively when the majority party was given a clear signal from its own voters, and especially from its likely primary voters. And then we saw inaction when faced with an electorate largely cool to the effort, and a Republican electorate basically split. All right, good luck finishing this week's work. We'll see you again next week, and as we exit this Unpacking the News, I'll go over a couple of the key terms I mentioned on the way out. See you soon.